taxation and compliance on small entities, what I call stacked taxation, which is tax stacked upon tax, and finally, we need to level the playing field for our local entities. So, just touching briefly on crime, as far back as 2001, Professor Al Francis had done a study estimating that the cost of crime was 3.7% of GDP. Now, in those days, our level of violent crime was about half what it is now. So I think we can fairly assume the same methodology would probably be close to double that. But other studies suggest between 5 and 6%. If our cross-country studies suggest if we had crime at the level of Costa Rica, our economic growth would be boosted by an additional 5.4% per annum. But we know, for example, that from surveys, that 6% of sales of all sizes firms represents on average the cost of crime, either for security costs or for losses that they suffer. So it continues to be very significant, and all the polling keeps showing crime at the top in terms of obstacles. The other is education. The leader of the opposition, during his presentation in the budget debate, pointed to the apartheid system that we have in our secondary school education, where about 70% of our secondary school leavers, I shouldn't really be grads, it should be leavers, leave without even the basic 5 CXCs with math and English that will make them trainable. Because the truth of the matter is, you need a certain grounding in math and English to be trainable. And if they don't even leave with that, then they're behind the 8 ball. The other graphs in my presentation, in the actual written presentation, which I'll circulate electronically, will show that we also have relatively low tertiary training participation. We have in the low 20s, for example, which is much better than it was 10 or 20 years ago, but still about half what it is in somewhere like the United States. I'm not talking purely university participation, but post-secondary training, whether at a Hart or community college, etc. But apart, even for that 20-odd%, a lot of that training is not aligned with the job market. So it's heartbreaking for me. I don't know if other MPs experience it, but you have small villages in your constituency that for the first time produced a lawyer, and the family has taken on a whole heap of student loans to allow that. And a year later, they still cannot get a job in a law firm. And we're continuing to ramp up our production of lawyers. But try and find a technician, a CAT-certified technician, to fix a piece of heavy equipment. And it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. I mean, it is very difficult. So we have to look at that whole post-secondary training system and reorient it towards the technical training. And I want to stop there and say perhaps the one exception, because I had the opportunity yesterday to visit the Caribbean Maritime University, and I was quite impressed the way they target. Their training is for jobs. Their training is not just for some theoretical exercise. And my time is too short to treat with it now, but I think on another occasion it would be worth the time of this House to have a debate on the type of post-secondary training system we need to develop in this country. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's public sector suffers from institutional sclerosis. And I got this term from the IDB study I referred to earlier. And, what it really speaks to is that there is this hardening that the bureaucracy has, just like how arteriosclerosis, my medical friend will say, speaks to the hardening of the arteries. The institutional sclerosis is a hardening to the public that it serves. It is weighed down by vested interest and influence. It slows the government's ability to adapt and reform, and the result is we have losses to the society, including lower innovation and growth. This is something that I'm not pointing any fingers at one side or the other. Certainly since the 90s when I first came to this house and when I was a member of the executive, I have struggled to see how we could shift the mentality of the civil servants from a controlling one to a facilitating one. And it has been stubborn. The public sector must assume its time-appropriate role now and purpose as a facilitator and an enabler and not a controller. Mr. Speaker, when you do, for example, the trade board, is the trade board really relevant today, or is it just a vestigial appendage? Is it something left over from when we had a closed economy before we've moved to a market economy and liberalized exchange controls, etc.? Why would somebody need a license to import a piece of heavy equipment? It can only be used in agriculture, in construction, or in mining. Why would we want to restrict activity in those areas? Mr. Speaker, I want to go to the specific recommendations. Now, the first is in line with what I just said. We have to embark, and I heard the Minister of Finance refer to public sector reform in one of his first presentations. And this is something that, as opposition, I know we would be happy to partner with, because we have to reorient the role and purpose of the public sector to helping people get through. That's right. Is that we have to let them understand that you should never walk through the lobby of a building, that a government agency that serves the public. See people sitting there and don't stop and ask, how can I help you? It can't be that you just have them there sitting hour after hour, wasting time, being unproductive. Their job is to help citizens get on with their business. And that, Mr. Speaker, is something that, as I said, we've been talking about it across administrations for at least 30 years. But it really has not happened in any fundamental way. Now, I want to turn quickly to what I call the dual burden of taxation and compliance. And this is specifically for the MSMEs, because large companies have the financial controllers and the staff to deal with these things. But when you look at the requirements for licensing, registration, but more so for tax compliance, if you are a small business with 2 or 3 employees, to be able to go through all of that on a monthly basis is really frustrating. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the truth of the matter is that that burden of both paying the taxes and the compliance is what pushes the MSMEs into the informal sector. Yes. Once they're there, it limits their ability to get revenue, because not everybody they can pitch to for business, certainly not government, for example, if they're informal. It limits their ability to access investment because they're not above board with their books, etc. And it limits their access to finance because they cannot, with the banking regulations that exist, access.
Mr. Minister, the time for presentation of his finish. You may wish to have a motion to extend the Speaker's time.
Mr. Speaker, I move. Mr. Speaker, I move that the member's time be extended for 15 minutes to enable him to complete his presentation.
The motion is that the Speaker be given 15 minutes. Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Bunting, you have 15 minutes to complete your presentation.
Thank you, colleagues. But, Mr. Speaker, beyond the challenges that informality presents for the individual firms. It also hinders planning and policy making. If 43% of your economy is invisible to the Planning Institute and Statin, etc., then you really are not going to be able to plan in an accurate and precise way, right? This is information that is, in a sense, this is information that is also useful.
Please do not disturb the speaker. Go ahead, Mr. Bunter.
This is information that's also useful for the private sector, because if you are planning a product to bring a product to the market, you want an accurate idea of the size of the market, where the players are, etc. So it has a bigger value. Now, I spoke with a senior chartered accountant, and by his estimate, any business that didn't have a turnover of at least $3 million per month, a typical business, could not manage all the compliance, the tax compliance requirements. They just couldn't do it. And yet, our current requirement for GCT registration is $3 million a year, or about $250,000 a month. Similarly, so they have to be informal. Similarly, individuals enjoy a $1.5 million tax-free income threshold, while a small company just set up doesn't have the same threshold, therefore a discouraging formality. So what we're recommending, Mr. Speaker, is that we raise both create a threshold for profit for company income tax to somewhere around $2 million to correspond to the personal income tax threshold. But more importantly, to raise the turnover threshold for GCT registration from $3 million per annum to $36 million per annum. And I'm going to tell you something that will probably surprise you. I've been in discussions with the Minister of Finance over the last couple of weeks on this issue, and he agrees with me in principle, not to the $36 million threshold, but to raising it from the $3 million threshold, because this is an intuitive figure that I'm sharing here. So this is not anything that I'm suggesting should be etched in stone. I've just based on the discussion with a chartered accountant. But he can get the figures in the various categories and buckets from the tax administration, see what is the optimal point to balance the giving up of revenue with removing the bureaucracy for these companies. And, I thank the Minister for his understanding, and I look forward to cooperating on this, in this regard going forward. The other area in terms of taxation that I think is a big impediment is what I call stacked taxation. Tax rates are identified by 70% of firms as too high. They're major obstacles. But this is nowhere more so than in sectors that are highly dependent on fuel. In these sectors, I'll just use a simple example. Say an entrepreneur who has a backhoe and he rents that out. He's obliged to charge GCT on his rental. His major expense, other than once he has bought the backhoe, his major expense is fuel, diesel fuel. About half of the cost of that diesel fuel is represented by tax. So if, let's say, 25% of his total revenue is represented, his cost is diesel fuel, half of that, 12.5%, would be SCT, ad valorem and fixed SCT. And then he has to charge GCT on top of that. So you see, you reach 29 or 30% of sales, not of profit, of sales, that if he's going to operate in the formal sector, he would be obliged to pay in order to remain formal. I don't think any business can afford 29 or 30% tax on sales. Remember, if fuel had GCT rather than SCT, then that would be an input tax, and he would only pay the difference between the input and the output, or the value-added component. But because it's SCT, it's stacked one upon the other and accumulated. So I recommend through you, Mr. Speaker, that we look at including fuels in the base of SCT, replacing the ad valorem SCT and a little bit of the, include fuels in the base of GCT, replacing the ad valorem SCT and a small portion of the fixed rate SCT. What this would do is improve economic efficiency, actually give an incentive to formality to people to register to the same backhoe operator to register for GCT, because now he could offset his SCT. And what is interesting is that this has actually been recommended by every IMF tax policy consultancy that has reported since 2009 to include fuels in the base of GCT. So let me now turn quickly, Mr. Speaker, to my last recommendation. And this is about creating a level playing field for our Jamaican companies to compete. In reality, GOJ policy does the opposite. And I'll just use one example. We have two companies in the mining industry for export. The foreign-owned bauxite company gets their fuel tax-free. The Jamaican-owned limestone exporter pays full tax on the fuel. What can be the justification to disadvantage the Jamaican producer versus a foreign-owned company? This isn't about xenophobia. It's about creating a level playing field for our Jamaican companies. And it's even worse in the area of government procurement. The GMA has suggested that we use government procurement to advantage local manufacturers and producers. This is not outside the guidelines. If you read the World Bank guidelines, they allow for this because they understand that the procurement laws allow for it, because they understand that local producers, there's value in buying it locally. You create employment, you have other linkages to other sectors of the economy, and it is overall more desirable. But in reality, our procurement policy favors foreign suppliers. And nowhere is this more so than in the construction procurement. Last year we had a discussion in this House around the mega projects, in particular the one that is being planned for what's called the Government Oval. Mr. Speaker, we had the most senior architects in Jamaica. They wrote the Prime Minister on this. This is the cover of the MOU that between the UDC and what's the company called? China Construction America, South America Division. The most senior architects, the College of Fellows of the Jamaica Institute of Architects, they have written the Prime Minister and they've raised serious concerns with this project. Namely, these are their concerns, not mine alone. Their concerns was that there has been no public consultation for a project with such far-reaching consequences. Members will recall the Prime Minister spoke to this being an $800 to $1 billion size project last year. They spoke to their concern for the permanent loss of use of Heroes Park as a major public recreational center. Now, this must be put within the context of increasing housing densities being approved for Kingston, and therefore the need for these green spaces. He spoke to the proposed demolition of existing buildings around the Oval, including the Ministries of Finance, Education, Labor and Social Security, in addition to virtually all existing residential and commercial buildings within a block around the park, including most of Almond Town, treating the citizens almost as collateral damage to this development. Up to now, there has been no consultation. The architects have identified the cost. Mr. Speaker, the architects have identified the cost of this approach to be astronomical and an enormous waste which will burden us with unnecessary debt for generations. And in case I'm again accused of xenophobia towards the Chinese, I should hasten to point out, Mr. Speaker, that these concerns are being championed by Mr. Clifton Yap, a Jamaican of Chinese ancestry. Last year, the opposition and others pointed to the incongruity of having a principal symbol of our sovereignty, the Parliament, located in a building designed and built by foreigners. We understand that the government has since agreed to a competition for local
architects. Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
To submit for.
Point of order, Mr. Bunton. Order, please. Prime Minister, say to point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The point bullet 3 is not a fact, and the member, having stated it here, would be misleading the House. The sovereignty symbol, which we take to mean the Parliament building, will not be designed or built by foreigners. We've stated it here in this Parliament when questions were asked by the leader of the opposition. We have launched a competition for local architects and designers, and it was always the case that our Parliament would be built by Jamaicans and designed by Jamaicans.
Prime Minister, I went on to say
that after
the opposition raised concerns.
You respond.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister had stepped out. But I went on to say that after concerns had been raised by opposition and others, and if the Prime Minister wants to say
again,
it was
Mr. Speaker, a point of order.
If you say it was never so, I accept, and I will.
Well, allow me to say, just for clarity's sake, and because this is a matter now of public record, we have always excluded from the overall project the Parliament and whatever buildings that may be agreed to be constructed within the Heroes Park, that those buildings would be designed and constructed by Jamaicans. And we have launched, Mr. Speaker, I repeat, a national competition for local designers and architects. Mr. Speaker, this was always the case. The opposition did raise concerns. We assured the opposition that the situation was that the Parliament building and any other building within the Heroes Park would be locally designed and constructed.
I accept that, Mr. Speaker. So let me now ask the Prime Minister the question. Will the local architects who participate in this competition be paid to develop these designs in the same way that the government has agreed to pay China Construction a $1 million design fee for an unsolicited proposal if it does result in them getting the follow-on?
Mr. Bunton.
Mr. Speaker, you're using my time.
No. The Prime Minister. Order, please. The objection of the Prime Minister. What is your position on that? You are withdrawing it, or the Prime Minister has objected and think that you have there. Are you accepting his objection or your procedure?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I said that I accepted it and I withdrew that statement. I said that.
Go ahead, Mr. Bunton.
And I will repeat the question. Will the local architects who are participating in this competition be paid for their work in the same way that we will have to pay China Construction a $1 million design fee for an unsolicited proposal if they don't get the follow-on work?
Mr. Speaker, another Point of order.
I am a little...
If the member had done his research, which you have prepared for us so far, a very well-researched presentation, this part is particularly disappointing. Because, Mr. Speaker, there is a publicly available document which clearly states that there is a fee which is shared between the local developers, UDC, and the development group, China Construction, South America. Split between them, which sets a limit of $1 million to the development cost, Mr. Speaker, done to protect Jamaica. And unlike other agreements, there is a ceiling put in there to protect the Jamaican people so that the costs don't go overboard. There is no fee yet assessed as $1 million. So your statement again is not only misleading, but it is totally wrong and dishonest.
Well, but you know, I thought I hope the Prime Minister would answer the question. But I agree, the fee will be a maximum of $1 million for the proposal.
Split between the developer, Mr. Speaker, a point of order since the member. The member has yielded, Mr. Speaker. So the member continues to insist that there is a $1 million fee to be paid to China Construction. This is not the case. $1 million is the ceiling, and it is split. The ceiling is split between the two developers, the local developers being the UDC and CCCA.
Okay. But the point is, there is
Mr. Bonten,
a fee.
Mr. Bonten, Mr. Bonten.
But we don't have to argue. Mr. Speaker, there is no good reason why, having developed a master plan after consultation, that these development objectives can't be achieved by multiple smaller projects with construction and financing separated. For example, if we broke this $1 billion development down into 20, 50 million packages, just for example, this would certainly be within the reach of our local architects, professionals, contractors, and developers who could construct these projects and have them funded by our pension fund. Mr. Speaker, instead, we have to be careful that we don't pursue an approach that will reduce Jamaica's participation to providing only flagmen, casual laborers, and drivers while we burn our chances. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, after 5 years of reforms under 2 IMF programs, Jamaica has not reaped the expected dividends to break us out of the decades-old low-growth pattern. Macroeconomic stability, while necessary, is clearly not sufficient to guarantee higher growth. However, as our macroeconomic situation improves, Jamaica must now focus on removing impediments to the growth of our local private sector, and especially the MSMEs, which can deliver inclusive growth, jobs, and innovation. While crime and education will likely require a medium-term horizon for sustained improvements, the oppressive taxation and bureaucratic regulation which drives MSMEs to informality can be addressed in the short term. Government contracting which prefers locals can be addressed in the short term. As our macroeconomic situation improves, Jamaica must be more discriminating in the type of investor and investment that we solicit and encourage, particularly where that investor will dominate a sector.
Mr. Bonten is being disturbed.
You're lucky you never drown off the little.
Too many members are speaking. You're disturbing Mr. Bonten.
Yes,
on both sides, please. Go ahead,
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has abandoned talk of the 5% growth within 4 years, along with his previous position as Deputy Chairman of the EGC. He's now pitching a new term, economic independence. And I have no problem with that. But if the minister is serious, then he should realize that true economic independence means that Jamaica should not behave like a capital-starved country. We should not allow capital to be weaponized in a sort of debt trap diplomacy. 1 minute, Mr. Speaker. 1 minute, I'll finish. And be used by others to obtain advantageous access to our market. Economic independence.
Mr. Bunton,
because
order, please. Mr. Bunton, because of the questioning of the Prime Minister on your presentation, I would like members to listen when the Speaker is addressing another member.
1 minute, Mr.
I say that, Mr. Bunton, because of the interaction between you and the Prime Minister, I would believe that you have lost about 2 minutes of your time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Therefore, you may proceed for another
2 minutes.
120 seconds.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the timekeeper needs to set my clock to 2. Mr. Speaker, we should not allow capital to be weaponized in a sort of debt trap diplomacy and allow others to use this to obtain advantageous access to our market. Economic independence cannot be about opaque contracts and predatory loan practices that mires our nation in debt and undercuts its sovereignty. We must instead seek investment that develops sustainable growth, strengthens the rule of law, and builds our capacity to stand on our own 2 feet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Samuda.
Mr. Speaker, I invite you now to, I ask you now to invite the
Members,
the Minister of State in the Ministry of Education and Youth to give his presentation. Mr. Speaker, he is allowed 3/4 of an hour in the first instance and an additional 15 minutes if he so wishes.
Mr. Floyd Green.
Try to impress.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to speak on behalf of 9-year-old Malik, who last week at his grandfather's funeral in my constituency came out of the church to remind me that he was destined for greatness. I speak on behalf of Unique Bygrave, a 17-year-old ward of the state who got 9 CSEC subjects and now attends Brownstown Community College and is determined to be a social worker so she can help our children heal from abuse. I speak on behalf of 18-year-old Ushnell Bryan, past student of Kingston College and a tremendous youth leader who served on our National Secondary Students Council and who, even in the face of sickness, had an indomitable spirit. Mr. Speaker, Ushnell lost his fight with cancer last week, but he continued to smile and laugh even in the face of great adversity. I use this opportunity to offer my sincere condolences to his family and friends. In all of these stories, Mr. Speaker, is the acknowledgement of the greatness of our people, but also the realization of the work we all have to do in this House to have their potential realized, to unleash their tomorrow today. Allow me, Mr. Speaker, to acknowledge my life partner, Querido, and my son, Nathaniel, both of whom keep me grounded. This presentation, Mr. Speaker, would not be possible were it not for the great people of Southwest St. Elizabeth. And I again take this opportunity to thank them for their overwhelming support. I especially thank my management team, constituency office team, constituency executive, and my team of divisional chairpersons, including Mayor Sangster and Councillor Palmer, who are in the well here today, and Councillor Smith and caretaker Bamidele. Mr. Speaker, through my teenage and young adult years, I searched for a Jamaican Prime Minister who would, in my time, inspire greatness and restore hope in my country. I am proud not only to call Andrew Holness my Prime Minister, but to serve on his team. I think we have finally found that Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. I wish to thank all the dedicated teachers and youth workers, our Permanent Secretary, Dean Roy Bernard, Chief Education Officer, Dr. Grace McLean, our head of our Child Protection Services, Mrs. Gage Gray, and our new Senior Director of Youth Policy, Nakita West, and Hyacinth Blair, our new Senior Director of Child Services. In particular, Mr. Speaker, I wish to pay tribute to our Minister, Senator the Honourable Ruel Reid, for his almost 30 years of steadfast dedication to the children of Jamaica. On a personal level, Mr. Speaker, I sincerely thank him for taking me under his wing and for guiding me for the past 27 months. And I will join him in the field shortly. My core team of Gabriel Hilton, Brittany Williams Sing Williams, Roxroy Montague, Kenil Stevenson, and newest addition, Nikita White, expertly blend passion and dedication, and our excellent sounding boards on this journey. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I dedicate this presentation to my father, Ronald Green, a man who hailed from the most humble circumstances in Garland, St. James, and who, through education, has been able to transform his life and to ensure that all of his children are tertiary trained. After 30 years of service to the Ministry of Agriculture in the Cayman Islands, he has retired and returned home. It is he who is responsible for any political acumen that I may possess, and I thank you. Today, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the opportunity to highlight the plans and the programs being implemented by this administration that will perform a platform to help unleash the potential of our young people. Unleash Tomorrow Today, Mr. Speaker, is about creating a cadre of young people with progressive and analytic mindsets, a youth population with developmental and transformational ideas, not simply spectators, but active participants in shaping their future, their tomorrow, by action today. Mr. Speaker, as we drive to unleash tomorrow today, we are cognizant that only significant investment in the early years of the life of a child will reap the desired results. For years, we have repeated statements of this nature. For years, debates have raged about the need to take a strategic approach to early childhood development. Mr. Speaker, this government is putting its money where its mouth is. The early childhood sector is being reformed into one that is focused on achieving optimal development for all our children, from birth to 8 years old. Against this background, the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information has developed a strategy which will see the establishment of 2 daycare centers in each constituency. That is 126 daycare centers, Mr. Speaker, across the length and breadth of Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, the strategy will involve selection of institutions in each constituency that has the capacity to accommodate children from 3 months to 5+ years. We will assess each to determine the type of retrofitting and support that will be needed. We will ensure that boards are in place in each institution, and then we will sign a memorandum of understanding which will outline the expectations and agreement of both partners. The Ministry of Education, Mr. Speaker, will provide trained early childhood teachers, will upgrade facilities where needed, will provide furniture and equipment. The ministry will provide resource materials, and children will attend these daycare centers free of cost. A total of $520 million has been earmarked for this initiative. Already 52 institutions have signed the MOUs and are ready to begin. Mr. Speaker, we know it is during these early years, the first 1,000 days, that the majority of the brain development takes place. And as such, we are creating a safe and conducive environment to allow our children to unleash their tomorrow today. In relation to the early childhood sector, Mr. Speaker, we continue to do what many thought impossible. This House must be unwavering in its drive to get our early childhood institutions certified. The team, passionately led by the effervescent Tricia Williams-Singh and the diligent Carleen Deslandes, they have continued to work with practitioners, our communities, and our schools to achieve the prescribed standards. Last year, Mr. Speaker, coming from when we took office, there were no certified institutions. Last year, we certified 113 early childhood institutions. Last year, Mr. Speaker, we established 24 new infant departments and 2 new standalone infant schools. In fact, our drive to certification, Mr. Speaker, has been strengthened by the Chase Fund, who has committed $120 million to assist in this process. Mr. Speaker, the team at the ECC is effectively communicating, utilizing new media in a refreshing way, not only to engage their schools, but to mobilize capital to treat with some long-standing issues. Team ECC, Mr. Speaker, has also taken a qualitative approach, and they have a new flagship program called Read Pon the Corner, which encourages parents and community members to read constantly and consistently to our children. As today is Read Across Jamaica Day, Mr. Speaker, I take the opportunity to remind this House and our people that reading is a sure way to unleash the potential of our children. And as the saying goes, Mr. Speaker, a child who reads will be an adult who thinks. Mr. Speaker, I turn to child protection. We all share this space with an opportunity to leave Jamaica better than we found it. I was truly moved by the words of Constable Anthony Taylor, who was on the front page of the Gleaner last week, Mr. Speaker. And he said, Mr. Speaker, I may not be around to see the change, but I want to be a part of effecting the change. Mr. Speaker, we are leading the change to create a stronger child protection sector with improved governance arrangements, increased staffing, and technology-driven systemization. In my last presentation to this House, I promised to take steps to implement phase 1 of a new governance structure to reshape the child protection landscape. We have since introduced, Mr. Speaker, the Child Protection and Family Services Agency out of the merger of the Office of the Children's Registry and the Child Development Agency. This merger is now approaching phase 2, and we will see an increase in the field staff as we treat with our approximately 13,000 reports that we get annually. We completed the final phase of our child case management system. This will create greater levels of efficiency, accountability, as well as improved record keeping. as information on all case files, Mr. Speaker, is now stored in a central system, making it easily accessible. This means real-time updates, real-time information sharing in relation to every child that comes into our child protection system. This will strengthen our responsiveness and effectiveness and will help us protect our children's tomorrow, today. Mr. Speaker, the merger has already started to bring synergies. When we took over, there was a backlog of cases at the OCR and the CDA. Approximately 7,916 cases were in backlog, Mr. Speaker. As at the end of last year, the Child Protection and Family Services Agency has been able to move down this backlog to 1,800 cases. And there are no cases of a serious nature that remain in the backlog. Mr. Speaker, the House will be pleased to note that the Ananda Alert Secretariat has recorded a decline in the number of children reported missing. In 2017, a total of 1,674 children were reported missing, which represents a 3% decline over the corresponding period in 2016. Of that total, Mr. Speaker, 1,476 children were returned home, which amounts to approximately 9 out of every 10. What we have recognized, Mr. Speaker, is that when the children come home, we have to strengthen our intervention to ensure that they don't leave again. Oftentimes, children are running, Mr. Speaker, because of problems at home. And as such, we have strengthened our partnership with the Victim Services Division. And last year, we intervened in 600 cases, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that our children had the necessary counseling services. Mr. Speaker, I want us to look now at our residential care system. In 2016, when I just took office, Mr. Speaker, the first thing I did was to go around the country and meet with the players in our residential care system, to hear from them what were the critical issues that they face. But I didn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. The team decided that we should commission a study so that we would have the empirical data as to some of the gaps that exist in our residential care system. We have done the study, Mr. Speaker, and out of that study, we have put together a 5-year developmental plan for the improvement of our residential care system. The first step, Mr. Speaker, is that we need to reorganize our home system. What we recognize that there were a lack of specialized homes. So when a child came into our child care system, they were placed at the nearest available home and not necessarily at the home that had the competence to treat with their specific issues. We have started the process, Mr. Speaker, of this realignment. In keeping with our commitment and our 5-year plan, the Merton Child Care Facility in Portland was renovated at a cost of $40 million and reopened in March of this year. Mr. Speaker, this home is the first government-operated, purpose-built facility to cater to children with special needs. It can, Mr. Speaker, accommodate 25 boys aged 11 to 16 with mild disabilities. We have already started the process of moving boys from other homes to Merton so that they can get specialized attention to enable every child in our care to unleash their tomorrow today. The improvements don't stop there, Mr. Speaker. Only last month I opened a new multi-purpose facility at the St. Augustine Child Care Center, which included a new administrative office, offices for social workers, counselors, and a new kitchen, Mr. Speaker, that will be used to train the boys at that facility in food preparation. This upgraded facility was opened at a cost of $16.6 million. Mr. Speaker, we're currently doing work at the Granville Place of Safety, which is valued at $25 million, where we're constructing a new multipurpose classroom. This will be opened in the second quarter of this year and will offer our female wards skills training programs. Additionally, in this budget, a total of $50 million has been allocated for continuing renovation to our residential care facilities. Mr. Speaker, I'm very excited about this allocation because chief among the projects that we are to start this year is to develop our long talked about therapeutic center, Mr. Speaker, so that we can have a space that we can actively treat with children who come into our care, but who are in need of sustained psychological intervention. We expect, Mr. Speaker, that this project will be completed over the next 2 years, but will provide us with a greater ability to ensure that all our children are embracing a better tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, there are 45 privately run children's homes and 9 government-operated facilities. All, Mr. Speaker, have to be maintained at minimum set standards, which are derived from the Child Care and Protection Act. The homes are routinely monitored. All have disaster management and contingency plans, which cover fire, hurricane, earthquake, and other eventualities. It is, however, true that a number of our homes were repurposed for use, and as such, they are still in need of significant support. Mr. Speaker, we have been taking proactive steps in that regard. Last November, we started a security audit of all our homes. This has been undertaken by the Guardsman Group, and it was focused primarily on the physical state of our homes and the presence of our disaster plans. Coming out of that, Mr. Speaker, we have constructed a priority list, and in this budget we have earmarked $14 million to assist our private homes with infrastructure support. However, Mr. Speaker, we're not stopping there. In an attempt to strengthen our monitoring framework, I have had discussions with the Minister of Justice, and it has been agreed and incorporated in our new Justices of the Peace Act, Mr. Speaker, that as a part of their remit, Justices of this Peace will now visit and report on children's homes right across the length and breadth of Jamaica. We are strengthening our accountability, Mr. Speaker. Our justices will help to ensure that we are unleashing tomorrow, today. Mr. Speaker, the tragic night of January 16th still rests heavily on my heart. We lost young Onika and Anake in a fire which completely destroyed the Walker's place of safety. The home, you will note, Mr. Speaker, was equipped with 5 working fire extinguishers, a smoke detection system, a fire alarm system, which by all reports was triggered on the night. The report prepared by the Jamaica Fire Department, Mr. Speaker, has indicated that the fire was caused by an electrical short circuit, which would have started in the front girls' room and spread quickly throughout the entire home. While we mourn the loss of 2 of our children, Mr. Speaker, we are grateful that 34 lives were saved. Mr. Speaker, I draw the attention of the House to young Selena Reed, who was the first person to notice that there was a fire and who ran through the entire building to wake up her other brothers and sisters so that they could exit the building. I want to also commend their chief caregiver, Miss Grace Allen. And Mr. Speaker, there is a gentleman by the name of Kimani Anderson who lives next door to the home. And as the fire raged, Mr. Speaker, and one of the passageways became blocked, it trapped some of the girls into one of the rooms. And Kimani, Mr. Speaker, risked his own life, entered the building, kicked off one of the doors to enable 6 girls to come out of that room into safety. Mr. Speaker, we are recommending that, and we have already recommended that Selena, Grace Allen, and Kimani Anderson all be given national honors for their bravery. In moving forward, Mr. Speaker, we continue to provide counseling support for our children who are at Walkers. The Child Protection and Family Services Agency is actively working with the Government Electrical Inspectorate to carry out electrical assessments in all our child care facilities. Mr. Speaker, we've decided also to reduce all evacuation routes to drawings and to have them mounted in our homes, a project which is being made possible through the partnership with the University of Technology. The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, has asked for a full safety review of all our homes, and that will be submitted to him over the next 3 months. Thus far, Mr. Speaker, we have raised almost $21 million towards the reconstruction of the Walkers' place of safety. We take this opportunity to thank all individuals and corporations who have answered the call to help Walkers. Over 80 Jamaicans, both here and abroad, have played a part, and their contributions have helped not only those children at Walkers, but children right across the system. Resources continue to be a challenge, Mr. Speaker, but we are determined to help our private homes. And as such, this year, we have earmarked $36 million to provide grants across the system for all our privately run children's homes. Mr. Speaker, we continue our promotion of placing children in family settings. 767 children, Mr. Speaker, are in the care of foster families. We can attest to the positive outcomes of children who are placed in a family environment. And it is for that reason we are continuing our drive for persons to open up their homes, inspire hope, and foster a child. Mr. Speaker, we have 200 children in the system who are ready to be placed in foster homes. Last year, during my meeting with the foster parents, they continued to lobby me, Mr. Speaker, for an increase in their monthly stipend of $4,000. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to announce today that through the Ministry of Finance, we have been able to increase to our foster parents their stipend by 100%, moving them from $4,000 to $8,000, Mr. Speaker. That is how you unleash tomorrow, today. Mr. Speaker, we're going a bit further. We're exploring new arrangements to expand our foster care services. To this end, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce that we will be conducting a pilot program with Family Life Ministries to establish our first privately run foster care program. Under the arrangement, Mr. Speaker, Family Life Ministries will seek and do recruitment and training of prospective families, all of who will be vetted by our agency. Family Life Ministries, Mr. Speaker, will also provide an additional stipend for families who are recruited through this program, in a true example of public-private partnership. The children, Mr. Speaker, will continue to remain our children, and accordingly we will track their progress and conduct continuous assessment of this program. Mr. Speaker, let me turn a little bit to adoption. We have committed to do all we can to increase the rate of adoption in our society. Up to March of this year, Mr. Speaker, a total of 217 children have been permanently placed in families. 171 have been placed in families locally, while 46 children have been placed in homes abroad. Mr. Speaker, this represents a 26% increase in the amount of adoptions over the period last year, a major accomplishment for the adoptions unit. We are committed to reform the Adoption Act, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that unnecessary barriers to the process of adoption are removed. Mr. Speaker, for years we have spoken about providing a solution for our children who are set to leave state care, but they have nowhere to go. Through the assistance of our international partners, USAID, the long talked about transitional living facility is finally coming to the fore. In June of this year, Mr. Speaker, we are set to open in Jamaica our first transitional living complex on Lady Musgrave Road, Mr. Speaker. This facility will house 40 females and will allow us to provide a home for girls who would have normally aged out of our system, but quite frankly, have nowhere else to go. We are securing their tomorrow today. But we're not stopping there. Work will commence at a property on Palmoral Avenue, Mona, in the first quarter of this financial year to refurbish a home that will provide us with a further 12 transitional living spaces. And the Deputy Speaker, who is now sitting in the chair, I know you will be pleased to note that the last quarter of this financial year, we will start construction in Southfield, St. Elizabeth, for another transitional home, this time to house 40 males, so that they have a space to stay when they have aged out of our system. Mr. Speaker, good. Well, it's coming. Absolutely. For years it has been spoken about. The work would have started, especially the preparatory work, and we're very happy that it is now coming to the fore. Mr. Speaker, allow me just to quickly mention 18 young people that we have on what we call the Child Advisory Panel. They give advice, Mr. Speaker, to our agency in relation to the child protection services that we offer. Mr. Speaker, those 18 children planned the National Children's Summit, which was held in August last year. And out of that summit, Mr. Speaker, the children gave a declaration as to what they would want to see us as members of the House place keen focus on. They list 16 points, Mr. Speaker. And I won't go into all of them, but just to say they were asking us to place more focus on increasing the amount of summer jobs. They wanted to see more community youth groups. They wanted us to incorporate anger management in schools. But, Mr. Speaker, the wards of the state raised a point. The wards of the state raised a point, Mr. Speaker, that I have to raise in this House. Mr. Speaker, they asked me to engage the House and the private sector in a discussion about how they are often treated. What the ward said to me, Mr. Speaker, is that oftentimes when they apply for a job, when they indicate that they lived in our government facilities, they are discriminated against. They say oftentimes the entire interview, Mr. Speaker, changes. An assumption is made that they are troublemakers coming into the place to give trouble. Mr. Speaker, as a society, we must stop that. the vast majority of the children who come into our care, Mr. Speaker, don't come because they are bad. They come because of neglect, because of a genuine lack of care, Mr. Speaker. Some of them, Mr. Speaker, have acted up. That is the truth. But, Mr. Speaker, when you dig deeper, oftentimes they are acting up because of abuse at home. Discriminating against them, Mr. Speaker, furthers that cycle of abuse. And I implore us to stop it. We cannot unleash their tomorrow today unless we give all our children a genuine opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the final two issues that I will treat with as it relates to children is to indicate that our Child Protection and Family Services Agency will be embarking on robust public education campaigns this year, especially around three issues: the issue of bullying, the issue of corporal punishment, and the general issue of child protection. Mr. Speaker, allow me to expand a little bit on the topic of bullying. The issue of bullying is real, Mr. Speaker, and it has to be addressed. Our anti-bullying campaign will highlight the prevalence of bullying and give real-life scenarios and indicate how our children that are being bullied can get help. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, we are strengthening our safety in schools framework, and we will be introducing a team of social workers to work with our schools. Because what we want, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that oftentimes even the child who is being the bully is in need of intervention. And as such, Mr. Speaker, we will be sending out our social workers to go into the homes to explore what is happening at home and to see how we can intervene. Mr. Speaker, allow me now to turn to how we plan to unleash our youth. Mr. Speaker, we are a youthful nation, blessed with some of the world's most gifted and ingenious young people. Young people, Mr. Speaker, who are the envy of other nations. We are grappling with other challenges of the aging population. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Statistical Institute highlights that of our 2.8 million people, 800,000 Jamaicans are between the ages of 15 and 29. This is the largest group as a sect, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, this group, I can tell you, they're tired of talk. They're tired of pipe dreams. What they're interested in is action. They don't want to be sitting on the sidelines, Mr. Speaker. They are determined to move forward, to make the best of themselves, and we must never take them for granted. This government will never take our young people for granted. As such, Mr. Speaker, allow me to draw your attention to some of the strategic things that we are doing for our youth. Mr. Speaker, for years, a new youth policy outlining the government's overarching vision for our youth has been promised but has not been delivered. I am happy, Mr. Speaker, that in Youth Month last year, we were able to table a brand new national youth policy. This youth policy, Mr. Speaker, from 2017 to 2030, is designed to address the major needs, challenges, and opportunities of young men and women, accommodating parish variations and specific sectoral issues. The policy seeks to define a common vision and framework for youth development. It endeavors to provide all youth with access to meaningful opportunities. And Mr. Speaker, I will say, the work for the policy started under the former minister. It did. Of course it did. No, man. A lot of work started. But let me tell you, we believe, I'm not going to spoil it. I'm always gracious. I'm always gracious. What we decided to do, Mr. Speaker, is not reinvent the wheel, but is move towards action. And as such, Mr. Speaker, one of the novel approaches of the youth policy is that the youth policy doesn't necessarily speak about the problems of our young people, because sometimes we spend too much time speaking about the problems that youth have. The youth policy looks at the positive development of our young people. The fact that young people in and of themselves can find the solutions for the problems that we face. We're now formulating a Know Your Policy campaign, Mr. Speaker, and we will go the length and breadth of Jamaica to ensure that all our youth are familiar with the youth policy. Mr. Speaker, we continue to focus on youth leadership. And as such, the Youth Division, Mr. Speaker, would have coordinated a myriad of national and regional training workshops for over 700 students, focusing on advocacy, leadership, proposal writing. We are very proud of the work of the National Secondary Students Council, Mr. Speaker. And in collaboration with them, this year we launched the Student Council Toolkit, Mr. Speaker. This toolkit is designed for secondary school students and staff advisors. The toolkit provides detailed information on starting, managing, and evaluating student councils. This will assist staff advisors, students, student councils, Mr. Speaker. And armed with this toolkit, we expect every secondary school in our country to have a functioning students' council. Mr. Speaker, let me go a bit further. Student councils are not an option. Student councils are mandated by the education regulations. So we expect not only that every school that doesn't now have one will form one, but we also expect that the young people will not only have a seat on the board, but they will be seen as equal partners in the running of the institutions. You know, the research has shown us, Mr. Speaker, schools that give their student councils more responsibility do better in every aspect of their educational journey. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to announce that the Jamaica Union of Tertiary Students have been able to ratify their constitution, which remained in draft since 2004. Mr. Speaker, we continue our capacity building sessions with the JUTs, and we partner with a number of agencies to ensure that their needs are treated with. JUTs has embarked on island-wide consultations with colleges and universities aimed at highlighting issues facing the tertiary student population and documented those recommendations which they will then bring to the government. Mr. Speaker, you should know that Jamaica is one of the few countries in the world that has youth advisors. This was an initiative of this government, Mr. Speaker, where we appointed 16 young people to advise our government on various areas of policy. And Mr. Speaker, they have been at work. In fact, our Youth Advisory Council has reviewed and made inputs on the National Youth Policy, the Sexual Offences Act, the Road Traffic Act, financing tertiary education. They sit on a number of boards and committees, including the Youth in Agriculture Policy Steering Committee, the Broadcasting Commission, Youth Conference Planning Committee. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it is very ironic that some are moving in an opposite direction, because we had some young people who sat on the committee that considered the national identification system. And they have said to us, Mr. Speaker, that the needs is long overdue. So those who want us to remain in the past, Mr. Speaker, we are not in that. We are unlocking tomorrow, today, with our young people. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, you know, Mr. Speaker, you know that
I love it.
Initiatives like the National Youth Parliament had stopped. And we have brought it back, Mr. Speaker. But not only have we brought it back, Mr. Speaker, we have gone to the young people and asked them, how can we reform the Parliament to make the Parliament more meaningful? Mr. Speaker, the young people themselves reorganized the Parliament. This year we have 93 young persons who represent varied youth demographics who were inducted in November as youth parliamentarians. For the first time in our history, Mr. Speaker, each constituency has one or more youth MPs. In Northwest St. James, we have the president of the Youth Tech Guild, Miss Tia Ferguson, who herself hails from Norwood in the parish. In Trelawney Northern, we have a seasoned youth leader, Mr. Akeem Dobson, who is the youth MP for Northern Trelawney. And in my own constituency, Mr. Speaker, we have a Miss Amelia Gordon from Treasure Beach, who represents the youth for Southwest St. Elizabeth. We will be providing letters to all MPs so that they can know who the youth MPs are in their constituency. And we ask that you work with them and give them guidance. Part of the reform, Mr. Speaker, is that they don't get to speak in the House until 1 year after they have been selected, because we want them to prove themselves. So the young people have said they will spend that year working on constituency and regional projects so that they can be of value to each constituency and to each county. Mr. Speaker, we still have a robust ambassadors program, and we have inducted 6 new ambassadors. And you will allow me for the House to recognize that for the CARICOM program, we've inducted Ms. Simone Townsend and Mr. Odain Horton. For our Commonwealth program, we've inducted Ms. Sophia Bryan and Mr. Nicholas Key. And for the UN General Assembly, we've inducted Ms. Santana Morris and Mr. Charles Young. Since their installation, Mr. Speaker, the youth ambassadors have undertaken a number of missions, a number of workshops, and have traveled and represented Jamaica quite proudly. Mr. Speaker, let me just note how well some of them have done.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the member's time be extended for 15 minutes to enable him to complete his presentation.
Those in favour? Those against? Mr. Green, you have 15 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your continued guidance of this House. Mr. Speaker, let me just note how well our young people are doing on the international stage. Mr. Speaker, the Parliament will join me in congratulating, and there are a number of them, so allow me to give them all. In congratulating a member of our JUTS, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Benjamin Fraser. He was recently elected as Caribbean and American representative on the Commonwealth Student Association. Mr. Speaker, Michelle Thomas, who is one of our advisors, She was elected, Mr. Speaker, as representative, as vice chairperson, with the responsibility for policy and advocacy on the Caribbean Regional Youth Council. But it didn't stop there, because she went to the Commonwealth, Mr. Speaker, and she is now on the Commonwealth Youth Council as a representative for special interests. Mr. Speaker, when we went to the Commonwealth and they were trying to choose a new president for the Commonwealth Youth Council, this House will note that it was 2 Jamaicans who contested for the top position. Mr. Tijani Christian and Miss Sophia Bryan. You will allow me to congratulate Tijani Christian, who came out on top, and commend Sophia and Everton Rattray, who also ran very good races. Finally, Mr. Speaker, in case you think our accolades stop there, the chairman of our Youth Advisory Council, Mr. Aubrey Stewart, was honored in London by the Queen as a Queen Youth Leader, Mr. Speaker. That is the caliber of our young people. Mr. Speaker, let me speak a little bit about our drive to reform and resuscitate our youth clubs. You know, Mr. Speaker, young people like a sense of association. Young people like a sense of belonging and a sense of worth. For years, strong community groups provided that attachment. Many of us in the House today, Mr. Speaker, are products of youth clubs. In fact, MP Main used to play football for the Wat Town Youth Club. And Deputy Speaker Frank Witter was a cricket star for the Cheapside Youth Club. And I'm sure, Julian. And I hear that MP Robinson was a cricketer and a netballer. But Mr. Speaker, the frank reality, a void has developed, Mr. Speaker. A number of our clubs have gone dead or dormant. And Mr. Speaker, we know nature does not believe in voids. And as such, now our youths, especially our young men, they find their sense of belonging, they find their sense of association in the gangs. That's why we have so many in St. James, Mr. Speaker. We have to take back that space. And we've embarked on initiatives to take back that space. Mr. Speaker, we have a Charge Up project. And what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, we're providing technical support for young people in communities who want to form our youth clubs. We're providing grants, Mr. Speaker. We're providing grants of $30,000 in the first instance. We have made 55 available, Mr. Speaker, for our youth clubs. We are now developing a youth club toolkit, Mr. Speaker, to help. The other thing that we're doing, Mr. Speaker, and I want the members to listen. What we're doing, we're forming what we call youth club assistants. We're taking young people, we're starting with 3 per parish. Young people from the communities that we're going to train and send to work with the youth clubs so that they can harness leadership, so that they can teach them proposal writing, so that they can ensure sustainability. And we're not just doing it like that, Mr. Speaker. They will get a stipend. They are going to be certified after the year as youth work development officers, and then they can move on through our various programs. We are going to rejuvenate our youth clubs. Mr. Speaker, allow me to quickly speak about some of what we're doing in relation to youth unemployment. Mr. Speaker, this government has moved with deliberate skill and speed to bring about the merger of the new Heart Trust NTA. This merger is facilitating a broad range of opportunities for the development of Jamaica's human capital. In fact, Mr. Speaker, out of the merger, what we are now doing, we are establishing 13 single points of access for customer interfacing for all youth who require training and career development services. Mr. Speaker, these access points will provide a one-stop shop for our young people, whether they want improved literacy, whether they're looking job placement, whether they're looking certification and training. And you know the plus, Mr. Speaker, this will save the government $17.9 million yearly. And we're also, Mr. Speaker, because of this merger, going after increased numbers. We have targeted a 14% increase in enrollment in the Heart Trust NTA over the course of this year. But our increase has gone further. Mr. Speaker, last year when I addressed the House, I said we were going to get 8,000 young people in summer jobs. But when we went and looked at the synergies with Heart, we were able to place 14,377 young people in summer jobs. But Mr. Speaker, we didn't stop there. We said that the stipend that they get, that it is too low. And as such, Mr. Speaker, last year, we moved the stipend for secondary school students from $6,000 weekly to $8,500. And we moved the stipend, Mr. Speaker, for tertiary students from $8,500 per week to $10,600 per week. That is what the new synergy brings, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are not leaving out our youth with disabilities. And in fact, we have an empowerment program, Mr. Speaker. And last year we trained 160 young persons with mild disabilities between the ages of 17 and 34 in job readiness, Mr. Speaker. Not only do we train them, Mr. Speaker, but we give them a 6-month job placement, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to announce that out of that program, 52 persons were retained in the sites at which they were placed, and a further 8 were employed elsewhere, Mr. Speaker, which means we were able to move 60 youth with mild disabilities from the unemployed bracket to the employed bracket during the course of last year. I will, however, Mr. Speaker, make an appeal to our private sector. That is only 38% of the cohort. We want our private sector partners to engage more of our youth with disability. And not to do them a favor, Mr. Speaker, but quite frankly, it augurs to the betterment of the institution. The research has shown the institution becomes more caring, more responsive, and ultimately more productive. Mr. Speaker, when we took office, youth unemployment was at 33%. In the latest report from Statin, our unemployment rate among young people has dropped to 23.8%, Mr. Speaker. That is an almost 10% drop in 2 years. And Mr. Speaker, this is not by chance. This is a result of a targeted, purposeful approach to the issue of youth unemployment, led by our Prime Minister and Minister Reid. Mr. Speaker, we developed the LEGS program, which is the Learn, Earn, Give, and Save. And under that program, we have attached 1,000 young people to jobs where they work for a year, they become certified, they get paid, And at the end, Mr. Speaker, there is a mandatory saving component. So even if they are not placed, they have savings to fall back on. Mr. Speaker, we have unleashed the National Service Corps program, and we have placed additionally 1,200 people through the National Service Corps program. And the Prime Minister has spoken about the program, Mr. Speaker. But what I will say, last year, Mr. Speaker, we put $200 million into the National Service Corps program.